Tonight, we travel to Salem Village, not to search for witches, but to understand how fear, once invited inside, can consume an entire community. Welcome to Tales from the Cr'wip't. Close your eyes for just a moment. Imagine it's January. The air is bitterly cold. Snow blankets the narrow paths between small wooden homes. Smoke rises from stone chimneys into a gray New England sky. The nearest town is miles away, and the world is quiet, except for the sound of axes striking frozen wood, horses pulling wagons through the snow, and church bells reminding everyone that Sunday is coming. It seems peaceful, safe, even ordinary. Yet, within a matter of months, this tiny farming village will become one of history's greatest cautionary tales. Not because monsters invaded, not because witches flew through the night sky, but because ordinary people slowly became convinced that they could no longer trust one another. Tonight, we travel to Salem Village, not to search for witches, but to understand how fear, once invited inside, can consume an entire community. Welcome back to Tales from the Cr'wip't. Hello, my wonderfully dark and creepy friends. Grab your project and get comfortable, because tonight we're stepping away from haunted houses and serial killers and into something I think is even more unsettling. Because this story actually happened. Now, before we begin, I want to ask you to listen to this story as though you've never heard it before. Forget everything that you think you know about Salem. Forget the movies, forget Halloween decorations, forget pointy hats and broomsticks. Tonight, we're simply visiting a village and watching what happens when fear begins to spread, because fear has always been contagious. Chapter 1: Winter Comes to Salem. Salem Village wasn't wealthy. It wasn't glamorous. It was a deeply religious Puritan farming settlement where life revolved around survival. Families depended upon one another. Neighbors borrowed tools from one another. Children played together, and everyone knew everyone else's business. In a place that small, your reputation was everything. If your neighbors trusted you, life was manageable. But if they didn't, life became very difficult. Trust. Trust was the currency that held Salem together. No one knew that trust was about to become the village's greatest casualty. The winter of 1692 had been particularly harsh. Food was limited, disease was common, political tensions lingered from the previous conflicts. People believed deeply in the existence of Satan and evil forces. To them, the supernatural was not entertainment. It was reality. Imagine living every day believing that the devil himself was actively looking for ways to destroy your community. That belief shaped everything. Then, something strange happened inside the home of Reverend Samuel Parris. His 9-year-old daughter, Betty, and his 11-year-old niece, Abigail Williams, began suffering terrifying fits. They screamed, they twisted into painful positions, cried uncontrollably. Sometimes they even barked like dogs, and sometimes hid beneath furniture. Other times, they appeared to be unable to hear or speak. No one could explain it. The village physician examined them. He found no physical illnesses. Unable to explain their condition, He suggested something far more frightening. Perhaps they had been bewitched. One sentence, one possibility, one explanation. History has shown us that sometimes all it takes is the one sentence, that one possibility, or that one explanation to change the course of an entire community. Chapter 2. The First Finger Points. As fear spreads through Salem, pressure mounted. The girls were questioned repeatedly. Who had done this? Who was responsible? Who was hiding among them? Eventually, 3 women were named. Tituba, an enslaved woman in the Paris household, Sarah Good, a homeless beggar, and Sarah Osborne, an elderly woman who rarely attended church. Think about those people. They weren't the wealthiest. They weren't even the most influential. They were already outsiders. History often reveals an uncomfortable truth. When fear sweeps through a community, the first accusations frequently land on those with the fewest people willing to defend them. 3 women were arrested. They were each questioned relentlessly. Sarah Good denied everything. Sarah Osborne denied everything. But then came Tituba. After hours and hours and hours of relentless questioning, Tituba, she confessed. She began describing strange creatures, dark spirits, animals sent by the devil. Whether she believed every word, or maybe whether she was confessing out of fear, or perhaps she was simply telling her interrogators what they wanted to hear so they would let her go, we'll probably never know. But what we do know is this one thing. Her confession didn't calm the village. It poured gasoline on the fire, because now people believed they had proof that witches truly existed among them. And if there were 3, perhaps there were 30 or 300. Because, my friends, fear and hatred rarely stays satisfied. It always asks, who's next? It's interesting, isn't it? History tells us that communities don't unravel all at once. They unravel one accusation, one rumor, one frightened conversation at a time. And before long, neighbors who once shared meals begin wondering whether they should trust each other at all. This is when fear and hatred find a voice. Chapter 3, a confession that changed everything. The authorities expected Tituba's confession to end the fear, but instead, it gave fear permission to grow. Imagine being a villager sitting inside that meeting house that day. You've already heard the whispers. You've watched 2 little girls suffering strange fits, and you've listened to neighbors speculate. Then suddenly, someone confesses. Not only do they confess, they describe the devil, dark spirits, flying creatures, a mysterious book filled with names. Whether her confession was true, coerced, or simply the desperate words of a terrified woman trying to survive, almost didn't even matter anymore. Because to the people of Salem, their greatest fears had just been confirmed. Or at least they believed they had. That distinction between what is actually true and what people become convinced is true can shape everything that follows. And that's exactly what happened in Salem. The snowball begins to roll. Almost overnight, the accusations multiplied. Children accused adults. Adults started accusing neighbors. Neighbors started accusing lifelong friends. people accusing members of their own families. Some accusations involved strange dreams, and others involved mysterious illnesses. Many centered around what became known as, quote, spectral evidence. Witnesses claimed that they had seen someone's spirit tormenting them, even if the accused person had never physically been present. Think about how impossible that would be to defend against. How do you prove that you didn't appear in someone's dream? How do you prove that you didn't haunt someone's imagination? You can't. But once that accusation itself becomes enough, the burden quietly shifts. Instead of proving guilt, people began expecting others to prove their innocence. History shows us how dangerous that reversal can be. The weight of an accusation. Today, it's easy to look back and wonder, why didn't people just speak up? But imagine yourself there. Your neighbor has already been arrested. The family down the road has been questioned. The church elders believe that something terrible is happening. People are frightened. They're getting angry. They're panicking. Would you risk becoming the next person that people wanted to whisper about? Fear, panic, anger, hatred, they all have an uncanny ability to silence even the most reasonable of voices. The louder that panic grows, the quieter courage can become. And that may be one of the saddest parts of this entire story. We now find ourselves with the court of Oyer and Terminer. As accusations spread beyond what local officials could manage on their own, a special court was created. Its purpose was simple: hear the cases and accusations, determine guilt, protect the colony. And on paper, that sounds pretty reasonable, right? Every healthy society needs systems capable of addressing wrongdoing. Communities should care about justice, and they should care about accountability. They should care about protecting innocent people. The tragedy isn't that Salem wanted accountability. The tragedy is what accountability slowly got turned into, because accountability and cruelty, they are not the same thing. Let's pause here for just a moment. There's a phrase I want you to think about. Justice seeks understanding. It's something that I learned in law school, and it's like a historical quote, and tons of people know it. It's like one of those well-known general quotes. But again, justice seeks understanding. Cruelty, however, seeks victory. Justice is willing to ask difficult questions. Cruelty already believes it knows the answers. Justice leaves room for humility and humanity. Cruelty often has no interest in changing its mind. Those differences matter, not only in our history, but anywhere people live together. Just food for thought, friends. Let's get back to the story. More names, more fear. By spring, the jail cells were filling, not with hardened criminals, with ordinary people. Farmers, church members, mothers, grandmothers, people who had shared meals together only months before. Each new arrest seemed to validate the previous arrest. If this many people are accused, some reasoned, surely something terrible must be happening. It's remarkable how easily quantity can begin to feel like quality, how repetition can begin to feel like certainty. The growing list itself became persuasive, not because every accusation had necessarily been examined with equal care, but because the sheer number created the appearance of overwhelming proof. The village found itself trapped in a cycle. Every accusation justified the next accusation, and every arrest justified the next arrest. Every confession encouraged more investigations. The wheel just kept turning, and with every rotation, it became harder and harder for anyone to ask, what if we've taken a wrong turn here? What if we are wrong? Then something unexpected happened. A respected church member named Martha Corey was accused. This changed everything. Martha wasn't an outsider. She wasn't poor. She wasn't already viewed with suspicion. She was respected in the community. She was religious. She was thoughtful. And if someone like Martha Corey could suddenly become suspect, then perhaps no one was beyond suspicion anymore. Fear has a way of expanding its circle. It rarely remains satisfied with the obvious, and eventually it reaches the people no one imagined it would or could. And when that does happen, communities often begin realizing, much too late, that the rules have changed. And this is when the village of Salem changes. Imagine walking through Salem now. Doors that once stood open remain closed. Conversations become quieter. People look over their shoulders before speaking. Trust begins to disappear. Not overnight, slowly, quietly. One cautious conversation at a time. When people become afraid that ordinary interactions might someday be viewed through the darkest possible interpretation, they often begin protecting themselves by saying less and less. Communities can survive disagreement. What they struggle to survive is the loss of trust. And once trust begins to disappear, it can take years to rebuild, if at all. And this, my friend, is where our story reaches its darkest chapter yet. We will talk about the trials, the executions, the crushing death of Giles Corey, and the moment Salem finally begins to question whether fear has led it down the wrong path. Only then we will ask the question that echoes across 3 centuries. What kind of community do we become when certainty outruns humanity? So now we find ourselves in part 3, when the fire could no longer be controlled. This would be chapter 5 of my little story here. If Martha Corey could be a witch. There was a saying that slowly took hold in Salem. If someone as respected as Martha Corey could be accused, think about how quickly the rules had changed. Only weeks earlier, suspicion had settled on those who lived on the edges of the society. Now, church members, successful farmers, people with good reputations were being dragged into the same accusation nightmare. Fear has an interesting way of expanding. It rarely stays confined to the people everyone already distrusts. Eventually, it reaches the people everyone trusted yesterday. That's often the moment when a community realizes this isn't just happening to them, air quotes. This is happening to us all. So here's the story of Giles Corey. He was one of those people who was an elderly farmer, and he was about 80 years old. He was stubborn, he was independent, and he was known throughout all of Salem. His wife, Martha, had already been accused of being a witch, and soon Giles himself was accused of witchcraft. But Giles, he did something unusual. He refused to play their games. He refused to enter a plea, neither guilty nor innocent. Why? because under English law at the time, refusing to plead prevented the court from confiscating his family's property after his death. The authorities had a horrifying solution. They laid Giles Corey on the ground. Remember, this is an elderly 80-year-old pillar of the community. He had provided, through successful farming, food for the community all these years. And here they are accusing him of witchcraft. And based on someone's generic accusation, this 80-year-old man is laid out on the ground because he refuses to enter a plea. And then they placed wooden boards across his chest. Then they began piling stones on top of that board that was on top of him. More weight, then more. Hour after hour, they demanded one thing: enter your plea, guilty or innocent. Giles reportedly answered with only 2 words: more weight. Again, another stone. More weight. Again, more weight. And again, more weight. Until the weight finally crushed the life from him. To this day, Giles Corey remains the only person in American history known to have been pressed to death in this manner. His final act wasn't about proving his innocence. It was about protecting his family from losing it all. Can you imagine the atmosphere in Salem after that? An 80-year-old man crushed beneath stones. His neighbors watched it happen. Families were grieving him. Children witnessed these events, and I'm sure they never forgot. And yet, the trials still continued. Sometimes momentum becomes so powerful that people struggle to find the courage to stop it. I mean, think about this. This man, literally somebody pointed at him and said, I think he's a witch. And they were like, okay, because you say so. And then they freaking try to force they try to force him basically to confess. There was a no-win situation. If he said he was guilty, well, you know what happens. There's fires and other manners of disposing of witches back then. And if he says he's innocent, there's no way he can prove it because they're already convinced that he's not. It was a no-win. He did the best thing that he could. He was smart. It cost him his life, but he gave his life to save his family farm, to pass down to future generations in the hopes that somehow they survived these witch trials. He sacrificed himself for his family, for the good that was left in the community. But how quickly that whole community turned on a man who had provided them with food from his farm for his entire life. Insanity. That is insane to me. And nobody spoke up and said, hey, this isn't right. This is wrong. We need more information. We need better evidence. Nobody said jiddly. I just made up a word. Nobody said jiddly jit or something. Nobody said nothing. Nobody said anything. English is hard sometimes. You know what I mean. Anyway, before I get too enraged at the unjustness of it all, let's continue our story. Now we move on to the executions. On June 10th, 1692, the first actual execution took place. It was a hanging. The victim insisted that she was innocent, but she died anyway. And it didn't end there. Over the following months, many more executions followed. 19 people would ultimately be executed by hanging. One would die beneath stones, Several more would die in jail awaiting their witchcraft trial. Entire families were shattered. Children were left without parents. Farms were abandoned. Properties were seized. Lives were destroyed. And through it all, many people sincerely believed that they were saving their village. That's one of the hardest truths history asks us to confront. The good intentions, because they don't automatically protect us from causing tremendous harm. Think about it. If you were to ask them today, they would say, we're doing this for our community, we're doing this for Salem. But all they're really doing is breaking Salem and tearing it apart. And when you think about it and you ask yourself, like, why? I mean, to me, I'm thinking it's because people are accusing just somebody else to point a finger. Look over there. Don't look at me. You know what I mean? People are turning on each other, so afraid that they'll be the next target that they're creating the next one by pointing a finger. I just can't understand it. Anyway, let's move along and talk about George Burroughs. One execution in particular unsettled the crowd. George Burroughs had once served as Salem's minister. As he stood on the gallows, accused of witchcraft, he perfectly recited the Lord's Prayer. Now, according to common belief at the time, a true witch wasn't supposed to be able to do that. The crowd hesitated, but only for a brief moment. Doubt entered the air. Maybe, just maybe, they had made a mistake. According to historical accounts, influential ministers quickly reassured the crowd who has, standing there kind of hesitant. Maybe we shouldn't do this. Maybe we were wrong. He just did the thing he's not supposed to be able to do if it were true. But the ministers quickly stepped in and reassured the crowd that the execution should continue. The hanging proceeded. That moment fascinates historians because think about that. Here is the minister who had served for a long time as Salem's minister, was accused of witchcraft, and he recited the Lord's Prayer perfectly, which he shouldn't have been able to do. It was proof that, at least to them, that should have been proof that he was not a witch. And that hesitation was caught by people who wanted this execution to happen. So the other ministers were like, no, nothing, no, do not hesitate. No doubt to be had here. Oh, he's a witch because we said so. Go. Pull the lever. What? And nobody said anything, because even when evidence appeared to challenge the narrative people had already accepted, many chose to preserve the narrative instead of question it or reconsider it. It's a reminder of how difficult it can be for a human being to change course once they've publicly committed themselves to a particular belief. Humanity and humility sometimes require more courage than certainty or rumor. But after this is when the cracks begin to form. By late summer, things were changing. The accusations had reached prominent families, people with influence, people whose voices carried more weight. Questions became harder to ignore, and people were like, is every accusation reliable? Could every testimony even be trusted? Should invisible spectral evidence really determine whether someone lived or died? These questions weren't entirely new, but now more people were willing to ask them aloud. History often turns not because new facts suddenly appear, but because enough people finally become willing to question old assumptions and accusations. And it's kind of sad that it had to reach the point where it kind of got to the prominent families and then, nope, put on the brakes. No, we are a prominent family. You will question what's happening here. It's sad that it took that to get to that point before people started questioning, but it is what it is, right? So, um, this next part is one of my favorite moments in the Salem story history. Not because it's triumphant, but more because it's hopeful. Someone, somewhere, found the courage to ask, what if we are wrong? Those words have rescued humanity from countless mistakes throughout all of history. What if we're wrong? It's such a simple question, yet it demands something many of us struggle to give. Humility. Not weakness, humility. Humility, the willingness to admit, I may not have the entire picture here. Communities become healthier when people can ask that question without being treated as an enemy. Looking back across 300 years, it's easy to count the lives that were lost. Harder is counting everything else that was affected. The friendships that were ended, the trust that disappeared, the children who grew up afraid, the neighbors who would never again look at one another the same way. Fear rarely destroys only its intended target. It leaves scars across the entire community. Long after the trials ended, Salem still had to learn how to become a village again, and rebuilding trust proved much harder than losing it. Part 4, Chapter 6, The Tide Turns. By autumn of 1692, something had begun to change. Not all at once, and not dramatically. Quietly, almost reluctantly. The confidence that had fueled the trials began giving way to something unfamiliar. Doubt. Questions that had once been whispered behind closed doors were now being spoken aloud. Had innocent people died? Could fear have clouded judgment? Had the village become so focused on rooting out evil that it had forgotten how to recognize actual justice? Even the governor of the colony found himself affected when accusations reached people close to his own family. He suspended the special court that had overseen many of the trials. Eventually, the use of the spectral evidence fell out of favor. Without that, many of the remaining cases simply could not stand. The machine that had seemed so unstoppable began to slow. Not because fear had vanished, but because enough people finally paused and paid enough attention long enough to ask, have we taken this too far? Have we gone too far? Soon, the executions stopped. The arrests slowed down. Some prisoners were even released. Others had already died. For many families, there was no happy ending waiting at home. A husband that never returned, a wife that never came back, children growing up without parents, property that had been taken, reputations had been shattered, and perhaps the cruelest part of it all, none of it could be undone. History has many chapters where mistakes are corrected. Salem isn't one of them. Salem is a story where the correction came far too late for those who needed it the most. Years later, something remarkable happened. Several of the jurors publicly admitted that they had been wrong. Some of the accusers expressed regret. The Massachusetts government eventually acknowledged that innocent people had been condemned. Compensation was later provided to some of the surviving families. Think about how difficult that must have been to look back at your own actions and publicly admit we made a terrible mistake. That takes humility. History rarely remembers humility as loudly as it remembers outrage. But perhaps it should. And here we are, more than 3 centuries have passed. The meeting house is quiet, the gallows gone, the snow that fell during the winter of 1692 melted long ago. The people who lived there in Salem are long gone, but the stories remain, not because of the witches, but because of the people, the ordinary people, the innocent people. People who loved their family, loved their community, who cared about their neighbors, people who believed that they were protecting their community. That is why Salem still matters. Not because the people were uniquely cruel, because they were recognizably human, and human beings are capable of extraordinary compassion and extraordinary cruelty. As I sit here and working on this diamond painting tonight and sharing with you this historical look over our shoulder back at Salem and what lessons we can learn from it, I keep thinking about one question. What is the opposite of a witch hunt? It isn't ignoring wrongdoing, and it isn't pretending problems don't exist. Communities absolutely do need accountability, because without it, trust erodes, and people can get hurt, and real problems can go unaddressed. But accountability is not the same thing as cruelty. Accountability asks questions. Cruelty assumes the answers. Accountability seeks understanding, but cruelty seeks only victory. Accountability leaves room for correction. Cruelty often leaves no room for grace at all. History doesn't ask us to abandon accountability. If anything, it asks us to pursue it with even greater care. Because once fairness is lost, everyone eventually becomes vulnerable to the same unfairness, even those inflicting it. There's one final thought I'd like to leave you with tonight. Every community, whether it's a tiny farming village in 1692 or a group of people connected across the internet, depends on trust. Trust isn't built because everyone agrees on something. It isn't built because conflict never happens. Trust is built because people believe they can be treated fairly, because they believe they'll be heard, because they believe that if they make a mistake, they'll be judged with both honesty and humanity. Once people begin fearing every conversation, every disagreement, every misunderstanding, relationships begin to change, and people become quieter, more cautious, less willing to reach out. Communities don't lose something precious only when wrongdoing goes unchecked. They can also lose something precious when fear replaces trust. History leaves that balance for every generation to figure out. Fear doesn't just change how we see other people, it changes what we're willing to accept. Imagine if someone in Salem could have stood behind a curtain, pointed into the crowd, made the most serious accusation imaginable, witch, and then walked away without anyone ever knowing who they were, why they made that accusation, or whether they had a grudge, whether they misunderstood what they saw or heard, or whether they were even telling the truth at all. Would we call that justice, or would we call it dangerous? Salem reminds us that accusations have consequences far beyond the person being accused. It changes the entire village. The question every generation needs to answer is this: do we want to build a community where people are encouraged to seek and speak the truth, or one where it's easier to throw stones from behind a wall than to stand in the village square and own the stones that we throw? Our time with Salem ends with the witch trials ending, not because witches disappeared, but because people slowly realized something. Fear had led them somewhere they never intended to go. History remembers Salem as a tragedy, not because evil existed, but because ordinary people became convinced they had no more questions left to ask. So tonight, as we put our drills away and turn off our light boards, close the door to the Cr'wip't, I'll leave you with one question. If history were written about our communities 300 years from now, what would it say? Would it tell the story of neighbors who built one another up? Who sought truth with humility and humanity? Would they say we were a community who believed accountability and compassion could coexist? Or would it tell another story? Maybe one about a village that accidentally burned itself down while believing it was actually trying to save itself. Thank you guys for looking back in history and kind of delving into the Salem witch trials over just a very general overview and some cherry-picked stories from the history books, if you will, and just kind of going down a 300-year ago kind of history lesson, if you will, and maybe what we can learn from history today. Let's not forget to try to look to the past to learn lessons and be better than that, right? So, yeah, until next time, you guys, be kind, stay curious, keep asking questions, and as always, stay naughty.